Well, welcome everyone. Glad to have you here. So today we're going to be covering a little bit about how to write for the web, which is a topic that's near and dear to my heart because I am a strategic communications graduate from Ohio State School of Comm. So this was something that was really drilled into our heads, and it basically affects almost all the writing that I do. And hopefully I can pass along some very helpful ways to maybe show you how to write for the web. So this is a brief presentation outline here. So introductions, most of you already know who I am. My name is Zach Ralston. I am the training and support specialist for the ASC Web Services team. I've been here since the start of January, and it's been a great time so far. So we're going to cover quite a few things today. Most of what we're going to be covering are kind of some basic principles for writing for the web, some how-tos, and some things you want to avoid writing for the web. And by the end, there's going to be some resources and some guidelines, especially because a lot of this stuff can affect accessibility, especially if it's for your website too. So if there's nothing else, I would just hope that you take away that there are implications for accessibility for your website. So when we're either reading or writing for the web, most of the time, you or your visitors aren't seriously going to be actually reading. They're most likely going to be just scanning and skimming for key information. And we typically do this looking for keywords and clues because most of what we're doing online is usually task or goal based. We're usually trying to get something out of it. To the example I have to the right here, if you've taken a good look at it by now, you can probably guess where this is from, just from the highlighting. This is just like the very first part of one of my favorite books, Don Quixote. One of the problems that this actually has, though, this was actually taken from Gutenberg.org. One of the issues you might have encountered is that it's just two big blocks of text. You don't really know where the paragraph ends anywhere. I basically had to highlight things just so for my own sake, not just your sake also, just to figure out what is this saying? What is this about? What's the point of this text? And that's just really to kind of drive the point home of like why writing for the web is so important. And like I said earlier, most people who are visiting your websites are probably not going to be reading Don Quixote, but they're trying to get something done. So if that's like a prospective student or somebody looking to apply to a program or just to contact your department, they're going to be visiting with that stuff in mind. So they might want to know things like just basic information about your department, where to find a building, how to apply to a program. And there's ways to write for the web that keeps your content engaging, but also improves your users' experience on your website. So you could probably already deduce this. We read really differently online and just with monitors and screens than we do with printed materials. There's actually a very interesting thing to do with language, especially when it comes to like Anglophone countries. We typically read in this like very F-shaped kind of pattern from left to right. That's pretty much kind of like the general pattern of how users read web pages too. And generally, as a rule of thumb, if it's taking too long for your visitors to actually find what they're looking for in your website, they're probably going to lose interest in what your department has to offer. So right here, I have two good and bad examples of what web writing looks like. So on the left here, I would consider pretty bad writing, mostly because it looks more like it's structured for an essay rather than it is for a web user's experience. You'd really have to actually put some effort into reading this. You have to be really motivated to actually kind of take in the contents of what we're looking at here on the left-hand side. And for the most part, it kind of just makes your eyes kind of want to glaze over, which is something we want to avoid. Whereas on the right hand, I basically have all the same information. I just basically just structured it differently, highlighted some keywords, things like that, put things in bold. And that way I kind of chunk my content people can kind of scan it much more easily, deduce what all this information is, and kind of keep them going and consuming information on the web page. So in this one, I kind of point out some pretty bad habits, or habits that I would consider kind of bad for writing for the web. Usually these are kind of like longer paragraphs. Anything that is above 2 to 3 sentences in a paragraph is probably going to be too long for your web page. It just kind of depends on what information you're presenting. If you read any online articles, you're going to notice that some of them probably follow a format that is kind of shorter, more chunked information, whereas something like the New York Times or some kind of long opinion piece will probably resemble something more like this. But for the most part, one of the bad things about this kind of writing for the web is that it's really hard for someone who's just kind of scanning your web page to kind of figure out where key information begins and where it ends. Another thing that I'm also going to cover a little bit more later in this presentation is what's called passive voice. And passive voice has its place in writing, but for the most part, you want to stick with active voice, because passive voice is more something like you're focusing on the subject, that's something that the subject is receiving, rather than something the subject is actually doing. Something is happening to the subject rather than the subject actually doing something. And that is kind of more or less a less engaging way to write for the web. Another thing that this whole segment lacks is any kind of bulleted or numbered lists. And that's another thing we're going to cover here in a bit, about how those lists can actually be more engaging for your website and provide better structure for your information and better organize all that information all on one page. And lastly, none of this has anything bolded or italicized that gives any clues to what's key or pertinent information. So here at this point, it's just like a brief overview of all the principles and things that you'll want to keep in mind when you're writing for the web. There's a lot to remember. And depending on which resource you go to, you might get 5 different things, you might get 7 different things, but these are the things that I picked out that are typically the most consistent in my experience. And not only that, some of this will affect accessibility for your website, and some of it will also help you think about, if you're writing content for your website, how do you kind of keep it engaging? Which is also why I included storytelling in here, which it will be probably my favorite part to cover in this whole thing. So the first thing to keep in mind when writing for the web is to make sure that you're chunking your content. And usually that's just literally just breaking down big sections of text into these smaller, more digestible chunks here. So for example, we have this stuff. This is just lorem ipsum text. It's just filler for the most part. But the whole point of this is to kind of keep things digestible. So even though it looks like a paragraph at first glance, these are only about anywhere from 1 to 2 sentences each. And that's kind of where I would recommend keeping that kind of stuff in the 2 to 3, around 2, anywhere from 1 to 3 sentences per paragraph when writing for the web. So a thing I mentioned earlier, and I consider this particularly important, is the use of active voice when writing content for the web. So this is kind of what I mentioned when I actually provided an example down here. When we're writing, we kind of want to make sure that we stick with active voice, because it immediately lets your reader know what your subject is doing. So for example, if this is a program that your department is having or an event, it's a much more concise, clearer, and quicker way of processing information than if you use your passive voice. So for example, we have some examples that I've highlighted. We're happy to announce Professor Lisa May will become our new treasurer for the Department of Web Marketing. Professor May provided over 10 years of service to the Department of Web Marketing, and we look forward to years of prosperity under Professor May. A lot of us are typically kind of instructed to write in a way that's not really as focused on your active or your passive voice. But like I said, this is kind of like a more quicker way of communicating this information than if we relied on the passive voice. But something like passive voice would be something more like, the Department of Web Marketing has determined that Professor May will become the new treasurer of the Department of Web Marketing. Much longer way, not really clear who the subject is at first glance. And it's just generally something you want to avoid when you're writing any content for your website. There are situations where you might want to keep it. You don't want to completely eliminate passive voice from your writing, but it's really just a matter of determining when is that going to be appropriate for your website. So the next thing here, and this is one of the other things I mentioned earlier, the idea of using your lists over long paragraphs to structure content and information on your website. So using either bulleted or numbered lists is a much better way of organizing series of items and information in your text here. So for the most part, in this example here, we have the exact same written content. This says exactly the same thing, even though it's all just lorem ipsum text. But you can see here, this provides a much better kind of concise structure. It keeps you engaged for the most part. If this actually had real content, you'd probably be a little bit more engaged in what this has to say rather than placeholder text. But for the most part, you can kind of see how this provides a much better user experience, how it helps your visitors process information a bit more efficiently, and it makes your website much more skim friendly. And lastly, this is one of those things that can actually affect the accessibility of your website's content, especially if it's with folks who are relying on things like screen readers or folks who have like a visual impairment and they struggle, or they might have to use like a zoom feature to kind of clearly read website information. And this is just kind of like a better way of providing a better experience for them also. So next is the idea of your page's purpose and the user task. So one of the things that you should always kind of keep in mind when you're writing for your website is, what's the purpose of my page and what's my message? What's the purpose of my message? Who's my intended audience? Is it going to be students? Is it going to be members of faculty? Is it going to be staff? Is it going to be the general public? Those kind of things. Does my writing help somebody new to my page find what they're looking for as quickly as possible? That's kind of something to always kind of keep in mind after the fact that you've written something. Giving something that you've written like a second look is usually a very good way of kind of making sure if that information is still easy to access and find. It also kind of prompts you to consider rewriting and revising content. Usually, and this happens with me too a lot, where if I might write something for a website or a document or a PowerPoint presentation, I typically will go back and revise what I've written anywhere from 2 to 3 times at the very least, usually because that way I'm asking myself, is my writing helping whoever my audience is find and take away the key points I want them to walk away with? So clear headlines and subheads. I have not actually seen this be a real problem. Most people are very good about this. It seems to be like the most intuitive principle here. But for the most part, just to kind of have our bases covered, using our clear headlines and subheads provides a clear structure to the content on your web page. It helps guide users to find relevant information, and it helps convey the additional meaning to assisted devices like the screen readers we mentioned before. And lastly, I think it's just one of those ways to keep your content a little bit more engaging, because it lets users kind of skim on a website. They're usually thinking about, where is the thing that I need to find? And clear headlines and subheads are usually a great way of just making sure that they're able to find that information as quickly as possible, and that your writing is actually fulfilling its purpose, which is a big thing. So white space, this is more of a design concept than it is an actual writing concept, but it's something useful because ultimately your writing is going to be part of your design on a web page. So for example, we have like the front page of our example site that we typically use for stuff like this. All this negative white space around these stats, separating these two boxes, and around this kind of big text here that kind of focuses everything. It organizes your content and it improves the readability of your text here. So here's the part that I have actually been kind of more trying to think about how to communicate, and that's storytelling. So you might not have this in your mind when you're writing something either for your front page or something that would actually be a little bit more appropriate, like the About Us page on your website, or if you're writing for news and events. So this is actually this is one of two concepts that I kind of want to impart to you that we learn when we study journalism, is how we structure a story and how we actually communicate key information and what we prioritize. So the first one here is what we like to call inverted pyramid. And I provided a graph here to the right. So literally, as the name implies, it's an upside down pyramid. And there's about 5 different structures or parts of the pyramid. So what we would consider the top, or in this case, the base, that's going to be the heading. And that's typically, what they see first on either a news story or your website. And it usually communicates pretty clearly what the article is going to be about. The one big thing here that I would actually really keep in mind. So in journalism, they like to use a lot of these kind of niche terms to kind of describe these things. But for the most part, in the inverted pyramid structure, there's this concept called the lead. And there's different ways to spell it. But essentially, the lead is the very first sentence in your article or your writing. And that communicates the most fundamental facts about your story that pretty much tell your reader what this is going to be about. And that has information about like the who, what, when, where, and why. And it communicates all that information in the very first sentence. And you can see it kind of like builds down to where less relevant information kind of finds place in the structure. So this third part, which for some reason, I don't know why they pick some of these names, but so we have what's called the nut graph, which takes up the third place. And that kind of is where you're building a little bit more context into your writing. You're providing kind of some more explanatory information into your story. It sets the tone and direction where things are going. Below that, they call that the copy. And that's usually the main body of the article that contains your text, any visuals like graphs, data, pictures of an event, things like that. And it's usually finalized by what's called the kicker. And the kicker is like the last point in a story or an article. And that kind of brings your piece to its conclusion. And that's where the least essential information kind of goes. But the kind of like short and sweet of the inverted pyramid is that most important facts are communicated first, and least and less important facts are kind of lower as you go down in the story, and they take less priority. And the second one here is called the diamond structure. If you've ever read any like pieces that are more human interest or story pieces, it typically kind of borrows from this structure of writing, where it kind of begins and ends with this specific person or example that is kind of like the heart of a story or a narrative. And this is something that you also might want to keep in mind if you're writing like a news item for your website, if you have the about section of your website, things like that, and events as well. The diamond structure, it focuses on a very specific person or example in your story. As you go further down, that's where you're actually going to see more context and more information. And it actually will typically cover a broader issue or subject associated with the subject. So for example, let's say the beginning of a diamond story let's say you wanted to cover the issue of refugees, the refugee experience in the United States. So you might focus on a specific family or individual, and then go on from there to talk about that subject a bit more, about what kind of barriers or struggles that refugees might have in the United States. And eventually you would go back near the end to kind of return to the subject, the individual or the family that you were originally writing about. So that's like another good way of structuring your writing and telling a story, where you're focusing on a specific person or example to talk about a bigger issue. And then you kind of conclude by going back to that person, where they are now, how they're doing, those kind of things. This should be the last part that I would actually want to communicate here, is the alt text. So alt text is basically just alternative text. I know I tend to harp on it quite a bit in other trainings, but this also does apply to writing for the web, especially because you will probably use multimedia when writing for the web, like graphics or things like that. And alt text basically just describes what that image is. This helps people using screen readers to better understand what content is on your website. And accurate alt text descriptions are necessary to comply with accessibility guidelines. And more importantly, though, I think it's not just a matter of compliance for compliance sake. It's writing in a way because it's the right thing to do. And one thing that I did include in here, because I have seen examples of this in the past with alt text, where people will write click here, or they'll write click here, not even just for alt text, but to direct people to click on a link or a button. I would strongly recommend you don't do this. Some people would argue that it's lazy. I would argue that it actually might cause a little bit more confusion for folks writing or relying on a screen reader or anything like that. So whatever you do, whether it's for a link or it's alt text, just please don't say click here. So here is actually a list of guidelines that I would definitely recommend maybe checking out. A lot of these guidelines I actually use to build this presentation with. Most of these will actually have very good examples for accessibility's sake. So if that's something that you want to really focus on, I would definitely recommend checking out a few of these links. I can post them in the chat after I'm done actually presenting, just so you can have something to go off of. A great resource that I would personally recommend is digital.gov. You'll notice that there's also a lot, if you go to Google, for example, you'll find a lot of colleges and universities that have guidelines and tips for how to write for the web, which those all work fine. I think this one is digital.gov, I think is a little bit, has an advantage because it kind of is more specialized to writing in regards to accessibility. And these other ones deal with specifically how to write for the web and kind of fixate on website usability for just your general audience. And last but not least is we do have a Drupal standard sites, a Teams group that I would actually encourage you to join. That's usually the quickest way to actually get updates, to reach out to one of us. If you have a question, you can use that link to join. And once you go and you apply, I can add you. And in that way, you can communicate to us a little bit more directly without having to rely on email or the ticket system. It's one that I'm probably most likely going to respond to the quickest. And it's also a way to engage with other content creators and content managers across ASC. And it's a great way to kind of share information and resources together, and just a place to chat as well. There's the Web Services knowledge base, which is a great resource that I'm kind of constantly always building, kind of including more sections about how to write for the web, how to use images on Drupal. And it's also becoming the repository for a lot of these trainings. So if for some reason you miss out on a training, you can come to the ASC Web Services knowledge base and go to the recording training archive down here. And that way you'll still be able to kind of find edited versions of training presentations. So you're not going through an entire unedited thing. It kind of gets you straight to the main point, and you're getting the same takeaways as everyone else who attended the meeting. And last but not least here is what we call the advanced layout showcase. This is actually just a showcase of all the features and options that you could use for your websites. This kind of gives you not only just a good idea of what tools are available in Drupal for your website, but also to give you some ideas of what is possible as well. It's a great way to come up with ideas, to kind of refresh the content in your website, to kind of keep things engaging. So I would definitely recommend checking out the Advanced Layout Showcase. And that's it.